The wind came off the prairie, smelling of dust and wood smoke when the crowds gathered along Medicine Lodge Creek. Soldiers in blue watched from behind stacked rifles. Government men spread blankets, unfolded papers, and tested fountain pens that scratched in the dry air. On the other side, chiefs in beadwork and brass-tacked belts formed a long line. Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Cheyenne, Arapaho, faces set against the sun, horsehair swaying from lances, rifles laid aside for the council. A flag snapped on a pole beside a makeshift platform. Between the two camps, a fire burned low. The men who'd fought each other all summer stood close enough to hear every breath. In October 1867, on this ground in southern Kansas, the United States promised peace. The tribes, exhausted by war and hunger, came to hear what peace would cost. The Indian Peace Commission had toured forts and agencies, urging a plan. Move the Southern Plains tribes from a life built around the buffalo to fixed reservations in Indian territory, with schools, rations, and tools to farm. Tracks were pushing across Kansas. Stage lines wanted safety. Army columns were tired of chasing riders who could vanish into grass. On the prairie, the buffalo still ran thick, but already hide hunters were testing the herds, and the railroads were close behind them. Everyone told himself the same story. Sign now, spare blood later. The councils lasted days. Speakers rose one by one. Satanta of the Kiowa carried himself like the orator he was, proud and sharp. Kicking Bird spoke quieter, measuring every word. 10 Bears of the Comanche laid out the memory of his people riding from the Arkansas to the staked plains without fence or rail to stop them. Black Kettle of the Southern Cheyenne, who had survived the massacre at Sand Creek 3 years earlier, asked again for safe ground where families could live without waking at every distant shot. Each insisted on the same point. The people could not live without the buffalo, and the buffalo could not live inside fences. If a reservation must be drawn, they said, its lines had to include hunting country and a promise to keep whites out. The government men nodded and wrote. They offered a reservation south of the Arkansas River in what would become western Oklahoma, between the Canadian and the Red, later anchored by a new post called Fort Sill. They promised houses for agents, schools for children, a carpenter shop, mills, cattle, plows, and yearly goods, flour, sugar, coffee, clothing, ammunition for hunting. They added a clause the chiefs held tight to, hunting rights, so long as the buffalo may range thereon in such numbers as to justify the chase. The tribes would lay down raiding on the Santa Fe Trail, accept the agency's oversight, and bring their people in each fall to receive rations. The words were all there. On the last day, the commissioners called the names and spread the parchment. Hands that had held reins and rifles traced slow marks. Some chiefs placed an X, others signed with a name they'd been given at a fort years earlier. Feathers ruffled in the wind. Soldiers stared straight ahead. Interpreters repeated each sentence until the last stamp fell. The councils broke with handshakes and gifts. The United States rode away believing it had done the clean work of policy. The tribes rode away with paper proof that the buffalo country and their families would be protected on conditions that no one on either side could keep. Winter hit hard. When the hunting parties rode north, they found settlers' wagons already cutting across the grass and survey crews staked out within sight of the Arkansas. Railroads did what railroads did. They moved forward. Buffalo hunters poured out of the new towns, shouldering big-bore rifles that could drop a bull at distance and leave the hide stacked for shipment. The treaty spoke of teachers and plows. The prairie became a platform for hide piles and bone trains. Annuities arrived late or thin. At agencies, corrupt contractors trimmed flour with dust and took their profit off the top. Men came in for rations and rode out hungry. Pressure built. Raiding had never been a pastime. It was a system, bound up with revenge, honor, and need. Now it returned as supply trains rolled and hunting camps spread like rash across the plains. Comanche and Kiowa riders cut into the trails. Soldiers struck back. Sheridan took command on the plains and gave simple orders. Winter campaigns to pin villages when food was short and cold did the rest. In November 1868, the 7th Cavalry rode before dawn along the Washita and hit Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp. Shots broke the ice on the river. Women ran with children into willows. Black Kettle and his wife were killed trying to cross the stream. The army called it a victory. Word raced through the camps that the treaty's promise meant little when soldiers chose their moment. At Fort Sill, the agency tried to hold the center. One season, beef herds failed. The next, wagon trains with flour arrived weeks late. Men who'd signed for peace watched their families thin. A treaty clause said they could hunt so long as the buffalo range. By 1870, hunters were already talking about empty stretches on the Arkansas. By 1872, the southern herds were marked for slaughter, with the railroad feeding ammunition and markets feeding demand. When the buffalo went, everything else broke with it. Tension boiled over in 1871 on the Texas road near Salt Creek. A freight train rolled into an ambush, the Warren wagon train raid. Satanta later stood before U.S. officers and, proud or reckless, claimed credit, boasting of trophies taken. The state of Texas demanded justice. Kiowa leaders were seized and marched in irons. Satank tried to sing his death song and was shot when he attacked his guards. Satanta and Big Tree were tried in a civilian court and sentenced to hang, then had their sentences commuted to life. Texas celebrated. On the reservation, anger fused with despair. To the tribes, the case proved the treaty had been replaced by the rope whenever convenient. To the state, it was proof that paper promises were a trap if raids continued. Parole eventually returned Satanta to the agency, but the ground under him had shifted. With the buffalo nearly gone and hunters pushing into the southern plains with impunity, young men from several bands rode to the Canadian River to face the source. In 1874, buffalo hunters at Adobe Walls woke to find hundreds of riders circling their post. The fight failed. The long rifles outranged the warriors, and the army answered with a campaign across the Llano Estacado and the canyons of the Panhandle. The Red River War ran hard and cold. Sheridan sent columns to break up villages, seize horses, and run down the last bands. By spring 1875, most Kiowa and Comanche leaders had surrendered at Fort Sill. The last free riders gave up their mounts and weapons and walked into the stockade fence. The treaty lived on in the technical sense, cost sheets, ration rolls, school registers, but not as a border that kept its promise. The hunting clause died the day the herds did. The boundary against settlers was paper against iron. Chiefs who had signed for peace found themselves arguing over the weight of a flour sack while surveyors platted allotments that would later be carved again by the Dawes Act and land runs. Children went to agency schools, learned new words, and learned, too, how often those words bent under pressure. Looking back, it's tempting to say the Medicine Lodge councils were doomed by design. That's too easy. Many men at the creek wanted the treaty to work. Some did their best to deliver rations and keep whiskey peddlers away from agency lines. Some officers refused to hunt glory and tried instead to hold the peace they'd been ordered to serve. Plenty of chiefs weighed the costs and chose the pen because they believed it might spare their families. But a treaty is only as strong as the forces around it. In 1867, the strongest force on the southern plains was not law. It was profit tied to the buffalo's hide and progress welded to rail. In the end, the treaty produced the shape of what came next. Fort Sill became the anchor of a reservation world. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache survived there, then endured allotment and the loss of more land to sales and fraud. The Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho, promised a neighboring reservation, faced the same reductions. The old life did not end in a single stroke. It ended the way a herd ends, thinned, scattered, and finally absent. The promises made at Medicine Lodge remained in the record, but out on the prairie the proof was simpler. No buffalo, no hunt. No hunt, no life as it had been. You can stand today near the creek where the councils met and hear traffic where ponies once stood. Markers list names, dates, and titles. They do not list missed deliveries, the long walk to the agency yard in a dust storm, or the way a chief's voice sounds when he reads a clause about hunting and knows the herds are already in retreat. The treaty was meant to stop war. Instead, it drew a narrow road that led to more war, then to surrender, and finally to a survival that looked nothing like the future promised by the men with pens. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.